Welcome to Power of the Tribe podcast. I'm your host, John Connors, and I bring you the podcast that helps you find your tribe and change your life. And today we have a very special guest. He's the best-selling author of the book Willpower Doesn't Work. His name is Dr. Benjamin Hardy. And today we're going to discuss his newest book, which is called Personality Isn't Permanent. How are you doing today, Dr. Hardy?
Doing awesome.
I was excited to read your book, excited to talk to you about your book. You know, we talk about personality actually a lot on this podcast. So, and I'm always telling my co-host and my producer that I want to try to change my personality a little bit. So this book seemed like it was written just for me. So I was pretty excited about reading it. We usually talk
Well,
about
yeah.
the Big Five inventory when we talk about personality here, and not so much the other. Could you give us some of the other personality sort of tests and profiles they have out there?
I'm actually really glad you guys used the Big Five.
Mm-hmm.
That's definitely the most researched one.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's things like Myers-Briggs. There's Enneagram. I mean, there's DISC. There's a lot of other ones. Most of those overly profiled. So like what's cool about the Big Five is that you're on a continuum. It's a spectrum. You're not just at one place. And research on the Big Five shows that you're going to change over the course of time on those, no matter what. I mean, you can fluctuate on those. You're not actually overly categorized. You're just at a certain place on one of the Big Five. The other tests are a lot overly simplistic. You just get a score. You're just categorized as a certain type of person, and that's not really an accurate way of looking at people.
People
But
love
what's
those
interesting
tests,
is
though,
that, yeah,
right?
go ahead.
I said people love those things. Those. I was doing a little online dating, and I find more than half of the women they know their Myers Briggs profile, and they put it out there. They say I'm a INTJ or whatever the heck it is, and I just don't find it very meaningful. But people really do seem to have interest in it.
Yeah, it gives people a sense of identity. I mean, if you haven't done a lot of work in kind of defining who you want to be in the future and kind of clarifying your past, these tests can give you a way to explain yourself. And so it's a really overly simplistic way of describing yourself. It does lead to a fixed mindset, leads you to overly trying to define who you are with a label. I actually, to be honest with you, this is kind of funny, but I've written about why these tests aren't scientific, and I have hordes of people attacking me because not only do they overly identify with the type that the test gives them, whether it's like an INTJ, but people can really come to defend the test as kind of a religion. I mean, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. So they perceive your attack on the test as an attack on their identity.
Very much, yeah, because they've not only have they identified so much with whatever label that they've given themselves through the test, but because that label is so meaningful to them, the test is kind of seen as like a religion to some degree. I mean, it's important to realize that people need a sense of identity, and
Mm.
I'm a big believer that you could clarify who you want to be. There's a lot of research on obviously shaping your identity and your future self and who you would strive to be. Identity shapes through stories. And so these tests can give people kind of a fast food identity where you're given a score, you're given a label. The problem is that you think that the label is always true, which it's not, like you're going to be different in different situations, but also it's bad for learning and for growth to do everything you can to confirm a label rather than strive to be someone more.
So, in other words, it can give you an excuse maybe to not work on some weakness you might have or something you do better at.
Well, you become really inflexible to
Mm.
anything you perceive to be outside the label that you've defined for yourself. So if you think you're a certain way, then anything outside of that box, you're going to be inflexible to it. Therefore, you're not going to give it much attention. You probably have what's called a fixed mindset towards it, where you don't think you can actually do it, and so you're not going to learn it, or you're not going to strive for it.
Mm.
That's a problem we see in society today. Like a lot of high school kids, they're trying to kind of abandon. They're trying to get out of doing in-class oral presentations because it's hard, because they think that they shouldn't have to do anything that's difficult to them. They should be able to be their authentic selves, which for them is not learning how to speak. And so you become really inflexible if you've overly defined yourself a certain way.
Hmm. That's interesting. Um, Authentic self. Yeah. So it's basically an out for them. It's an out not to put in the effort to grow.
Yeah, it also limits your imagination for what you could become. I mean, there's research from Daniel Gilbert. He's at Harvard, and he spent a lot of time asking people. He studies personality change over time. And by the way, you're not the only person who wants to change their personality. Over 90% of people would love to make adjustments in who they are. I think most of us want to improve ourselves, whether it's our confidence, our creativity, whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty normal to want to make improvements. But what Dr. Gilbert has studied, first off, he'll ask people, are you the exact same person you were 10 years ago?
Mm,
I'd ask you that question first. Do you think you're the exact same person you were 10 years ago?
absolutely not.
Yeah, I think that's how most people feel. What's funny though is that you're a different person to the extent you probably have different values, maybe not different values to huge extents, but you've got different priorities, different perspectives, different goals, maybe different relationships, different habits. Well, what most people think, even if they've seen big change in their past, he'll then ask people, do you think you're going to be just as different in the future as you are from who you were in the past? And most people don't think so. Most people think that the future version of them is going to look a lot like who they are today. So Gilbert says human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. But the reason for that is because we don't take the time to imagine who we want to be and then use that as the basis for where we go.
We just sort of go through life and have our experiences and things happen and we change, but we're not using our imagination necessarily to direct that change.
Yeah. Well, I mean, being intentional, being conscious, what we study in psychology is a concept called deliberate practice. Malcolm Gladwell popularized it as the 10,000-hour rule,
Yeah.
But it's not really the 10,000-hour rule, because you could do something for 10,000 hours and not get any better at it. Deliberate practice is the idea that you have a vision of your future self. You've got a perspective, and then what you do on a daily basis is working towards that. You're being deliberate on a daily basis, or conscious or intentional. And so, yeah, you can't. What the research shows, and it makes intuitive sense. If you don't know who you want to be, it doesn't matter who you are today. You can't actually make good decisions on a daily basis if you don't have a future self in mind, because if you don't know who you want to be, then it really doesn't matter who you are today. And I think that's one of the big problems, actually. One of the reasons why people think personality is so predictable is because they haven't taken the time to conceptualize who their future self is. And so instead of actively making decisions towards where they want to go, they're actually just living up to the roles that they've already established in their environment. They're living up to the expectations of those around them. They're just kind of in the routine of whatever their life is situated to become. That's basically living on autopilot, which is being subconscious and basically just being who you've been.
That's very interesting. I'm a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructor and coach, and I also started competing in the Masters divisions after I think I took 18 and a half years off from competing, and I had a goal to become the Masters world champion, basically the old guy world champion. So one of the things that I did is I created a T-shirt, and on the back of the shirt in big letters it said, "What would a world champ do?" And I took that shirt and I hung it on my closet door, so it was the first thing I saw when I woke up in the morning and the last thing that I saw when I went to bed at night. So when I woke up, what would a world champ do today? And that sort of directed my behaviors and my practices and my habits. And lo and behold, I got the world championship after 18 months. I ended up becoming the world champion.
What's crazy about that? I love that. That is such a good story. I'm in love with that. So what Hal Hershfield, he's a psychologist at UCLA, and he studies how having a future self concept influences your decision making. It's important to realize that your future, one of the things that all of this research shows is that it's actually important to realize that your future self is not who you are today. You're not, they're going to be different persons. They've got different priorities, different perspectives, different preferences. And it's actually good for decision making. Literally what you just did, rather than saying, what do I want to do today? It's what would my future self want me to do? Or what would a world champ do today? Rather than what would you do today, what would a world champ do? And if you can make decisions based on what your future self would want you to do, then you could actually make good decisions today versus what you would just simply prefer, whatever the situation would merit. So I'm in love with that. That's cool.
Right. And the decisions that the world champ do involve pain and energy, so I had to eat very strict I had to, lose some body fat. I had to work hard, get in shape. I had to improve. So all of that, involved. I had to fight through a lot of resistance to do that. So yeah, if I just let myself do it instead of the world champ, I probably wouldn't have done what it took to get there.
You wouldn't have.
And,
You wouldn't have. I
and,
mean, what?
and today I'm sitting
I
here.
really, yeah.
Today I'm sitting here in this lockdown, and there's no competitions. They've canceled all the competitions for the year, and lo and behold, I'm about 8 pounds heavier than my competition weight, and it's harder for me to eat properly because I've lost the track of that. What would a world champ do? I'm going to bounce back pretty quickly, I'm sure, but it was so much easier with that guiding star to focus on, to do the things on a day-to-day basis that I wanted to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this situation can throw things off, for sure. But I think that, I've asked a lot of people, how does your future self concept help you get beyond COVID-19? And it really can. I mean, if you don't have a future self, this situation can really throw you off. I mean, and it's hard not to it's hard to not get thrown off by something this big. But if you're clear on the future self, even if the situation's changed, and yeah, right now your situation's totally changed because there's no competition. So there's nothing actively to be planning for. That can be tough. But even still,
So
I'm thinking about like the NBA lockdown and stuff. Like there's still some people probably training pretty hard.
Right. Actually, I live with my son, so it's just him and I, so we can train with each other, and he's an excellent competitor. We're not contributing to any extra contact when we train together because we live together, and we're making some really good progress in our training. But what I'm hanging on now is just a more abstract idea of mastery. I want to be a master. I actually came up with the idea of I want to be a master at practice. So when I go to practice, I want to master the art of practicing and training and getting as much learning out of each experience that I have, each practice section. But I find it's more difficult because it's a more abstract concept than I want to win a certain competition.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I'm not really sure because I find that from a deliberate practice standpoint, it's difficult. It is difficult to practice in a meaningful way without a goal. It's good to have mentors and things like that who provide totally different perspectives, and abstraction is very good, and it's good to have alternative perspectives. But the learning from that approach, it's because it's not targeted. It's going to be difficult to actually hold on to it and remember what you can get with it.
Right. So we train in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that art, but it's a sport like judo or wrestling, I guess, is a good comparison. So it's very physical.
The only knowledge I have on it, I've studied a lot of Josh Waitzkin. So I've heard him talk about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu an enormous amount.
Right. And it's a wonderful art because it lends itself to deliberate practice because you're sparring, with sort of live feedback. Your partner's resisting essentially 100% when you train, so you're getting very realistic feedback. But the challenge is when people don't train deliberately enough. If they just go in and sort of freestyle and just have a match, so to speak, instead of deliberately setting up their practice. So when my son and I train, we'll limit the scope of what we're doing so that we have more controls and the practice can be more deliberate, but it still can be intense and still live.
Well, here's a question for you. I mean, what would the outcome be of you becoming a master practicer? Like, what would I know that
okay, that's a great question.
Avoiding an outcome, but what is that? What are you actually hoping to get out of that? Are you hoping to be a master learner? Like, what does it actually look like at the end of the day for you to be a master practicer? Because there's got to be a reason behind that.
Yeah, and the reason is to be the best coach that I can be, so I can sort of model to my students.
That's where the deliberate practice would come. Is that you're ultimately doing this so that you can become a better coach.
Exactly. And I'm really motivated. I mean, this sounds selfish to say this, but I think it's only natural. I'm coaching my son, so I want to be the best coach for him when he's out there competing. Of course, I want to be the best coach for all my students, but I'm sure you, as a father, you know that our kids tug on us with a special pull.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, to me, that's a beautiful motivation. I mean, if your future self, the vision the person you're visualizing yourself to be is the ultimate coach for your son and for others. And that in order for you to do that, you've got to become really good at understanding training and practice and development. Then everything that you're doing is to help you to become that person. I mean, I think that there's deep why. And I mean, that to me is a way that you could deliberately practice at becoming a better coach so that you can be better at helping your son and others. So, I mean, to me, that makes a lot of sense.
A lot of the practice involves frustration because you're essentially trying to strangle your opponent and they're trying to strangle you, and it's this struggle, it's this controlled conflict. So it's fertile ground for a lot of sort of exploration of yourself and frustration when you don't get the result that you want. And the other thing I'm trying to learn is what I'm trying to become is master of that, master of my frustration. So I don't spend too much time in frustration, and so that I can take that behavior, that model of how I'm practicing my jiu-jitsu, and just bring it into my life in a greater way.
Yeah. In psychology, there's two terms that come to mind. One is tolerance for ambiguity, which is essentially just your ability to deal with uncertainty. But the bigger one, the much bigger one, and this actually relates to learning and also personality development, is a concept called psychological flexibility. It's just basically being able to, a big reason why people stop learning and stop developing is because they become a little bit more rigid psychologically. Trauma can lead to psychological rigidity. Having a fixed mindset can lead to psychological rigidity, but emotional and psychological flexibility is where you really learn how to emotionally regulate. You can be flexible in how you see yourself. You can handle your emotions. You hold them a little bit more loosely. You also hold your own identity a little bit more loosely, and you can obviously grow. I mean, psychological flexibility is a big one for handling uncertainty, difficulty, frustration. And I think it's really how you get to move forward. I mean, my daughters, just as an example, we have two 15-month-old twins. We live here in Florida, and so like they're doing swimming lessons, and it's funny to watch these two little babies, get dropped in the pool, and like them having to learn how to do this. Obviously, how many adults would put themselves under such extreme learning, right? Where like they don't love it, but they're learning so fast. When my wife and I became foster parents of 3 kids, this was during the first year of my PhD program, and we ended up adopting them 3 years later. But
wow,
we, so we ended up adopting those kids, and then a month later, my wife got pregnant with twins. So in 2015, we adopted 3 and had twins. It was crazy. But the first year we got these 3 kids, and it was when we had never been parents before. We were both first-year graduate students. It felt as extreme to some degrees as the kids getting dropped in the pool, because we'd never been parents. Now these 3 kids we have, they've got all these crazy psychological challenges, throwing chairs, just having tantrums, and when you're in a situation like that, you're really forced to rethink everything and forced to adapt. And I'm glad for that experience, because I would have never learned a lot of the situations had I not forced myself into that situation. I wouldn't have been as flexible or as patient. And I think that the reason people's personality doesn't adjust and change over time, they get kind of frozen in the past, is because they stop putting themselves under such constraint, under such challenge,
Right. Well, at the basic level, humans move toward pain, away from pleasure. Away from pain toward pleasure, and they conserve energy, right? So that's part of the challenge of changing yourself. It involves some pain and energy expenditure, right?
Yeah, but that's but if you have a higher purpose, like a future self,
that gives you the motivation.
Then you stop operating by those rules.
Like
for my kid, like the pain pleasure principle that is the common view of personality, and it's for people without a higher purpose to drive them outside of those rules. Yeah. The most natural thing to do would be to just avoid your fears and challenges and just do what's natural and easy. But to learn, if you have a higher sense of purpose, that purpose becomes the new grounding principle rather than pain and pleasure. And you go through, you're way more willing to go through transformational learning and hardship, because the purpose is far more worth it and powerful than whatever you experience in the moment.
Mm. That's why you emphasize, I think, goal and identity in your book uh, to help you change
And
personality.
very much,
Yeah.
yeah.
Let me ask you this. I'll be selfish here. So before I enter my training with my son, I take about a minute and I sort of meditate. I don't have any formal methodology. I just think to myself, you're a master learner. You've mastered yourself, your frustration. Um, you don't need your ego here. You're just immersing yourself in the learning process. And I try to get my mind in the right place. It, could you give me any practical way to improve that, or what do you think about that process I'm using?
This is before you start training with your son?
Right before I start, like I warming my body up, and before we get into it, I take about a minute and I try to get connected to that. I guess you would say that future self, that identity where I'm a master coach, master
Yeah.
learner. But I don't know
I
what
think
I'm
that's
doing. I'm
really
just
good.
trying to imagine it. Is there anything
I
practical?
would do more, though. Yeah,
Okay.
I would do more than just that. I think that that's essential. I think
Okay.
that's essential right before. Just
Mm-hmm.
as an example, when I drive home, because I have an office, when I drive home to be with my kids, I know, especially right now, given the quarantine, there's going to be 5 kids all over the place wanting
Mm.
to, burn energy, especially my 2 sons. And it's easy for me to just not be intentional when I say, and so I think that, obviously when I'm driving home, I'm like, all right, who do I need to be for my kids right now? But I think that it coupled with that is lots of journaling sessions. Just as an example, separate from right before the episode.
Mm-hmm.
Like I journaled this morning because right now one of my core focuses is obviously to be a lot more engaged with my kids. Like I want to be just as focused and excellent with my kids as I am with my work. And so it's like
Mm.
I'm writing about that thing and thinking about what that looks like so that I have additional insights versus just right before.
Mm.
But
Mm.
also kind of thinking about what does your son need? Like, yes, you're the master coach and you're amazing and it's good to visualize that, but it's like, what would make this optimal for your son right now? Like who does your son need you to be right now?
Mm.
And thinking about like, what does that look like when you're showing up the absolute way to just make him shine? So like, I think maybe asking slightly different questions,
Mm.
may help as well. But I think just the right before, I think the fact that you're just doing that means that you're being intentional in that coaching session. And so I would just add additional visualizations where you've got more time to think about, how you show up for your son, what kind of attributes you could bring to that, and who you want to be. I would take more time to reflect and journal and visualize on that outside right before as well.
So, in other words, to define it more, make that identity more crystal clear.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
also maybe even talk to your son about it. Like what is, obviously you have perspectives that your son doesn't have as far as what good training looks like and stuff, but he also has perspectives you don't have as far as maybe where your current training is not landing, or maybe where it's pushing him the wrong direction. Like I think continuing to get context so that you can be the best version of you, but also the best version for him.
I.
Asking
Mm-hmm.
where isn't it working? You know what I mean? And getting his
Mm-hmm.
perspective so you can be the best coach for him specifically.
Right. I think part of the challenge I have is that I'm sort of in two roles. I'm still learning as a student, and I'm still somewhat of a competitor, and I'm a coach. And I think
I think
that's,
that's actually good for you.
yeah, I think it is as well, because it's easier for me to be a positive role model for my students uh, when I'm actually engaged in the same thing that they're engaged in, and I'm trying to show them this is how you learn. This is how you want to practice. This is proper practice.
Yeah. I wonder, to the extent, and I know that you gauge things with your kids, and or even with your son or whatever the situation is, but I wonder if
Well, to be clear, my son is
and I mean,
is an adult, so
yeah.
we're very much colleagues, and we're learning together. So we're learning new techniques together as well. So it's not I'm
How
giving it.
different? Yeah, yeah. Okay, that makes that makes a lot more sense. Yeah, yeah. That's good to know. What obviously there's routine training. How often do you guys do kind of a totally mixed up scenario where like I'm thinking cross training in a totally different, it could be in a different art or in a radically different situation for kind of a more lateral learning perspective. where you're in it, like, rather than training in the same situation over and over, like maybe you totally change the context a little bit so that there's new constraints which require different, you know what I mean? Like I wonder, and also
Yeah.
just that's really good for flexibility thinking as well. You know what I mean? But also,
Well, ultimately,
I'm
this
guessing you guys are all pretty clear on the goal,
yeah
but I
the
wonder how
goal.
you can push beyond that. Go ahead.
Yeah, the sport is very technical actually. So in competition, the more technical athlete wins, essentially 100% of the time. There's virtually no luck involved. So what we do is we do a lot of controlled situational training, where we try to shrink down the sort of the situation, and then we can dig deeper into the position. But there's such a variety of positions that I think we do get what you're saying a little bit uh, of a sort of a perspective from all sides. But the sport is mature enough and deep enough that training in some other sport at this point probably isn't going to help our
No.
development too much. Yeah.
No, I don't maybe mean another sport. Maybe it's just. I mean, it is mature and deep enough. I wonder if so. Even still, you go to the things that maybe lend to what you're comfortable with. The whatever
Oh,
whatever
I
the
see what you're
holds of the
saying.
grip
Yeah,
or
yeah,
however it works.
yeah. I totally understand what you're saying. So we do a good job of putting ourselves in really bad positions at times, and and embracing discomfort. That's the wonderful thing about the sport and the martial art. There's so many opportunities to put yourself in a very uncomfortable position. And even though I've been doing it for 20 years, I'm still liable to have stress responses and feel really awful at times and feel a little panicky. And I have to work on dealing with those feelings in those situations. So that's probably why I love this martial art and this sport.
Is there any training? I'm just wondering. Like, I know that you can't. I mean, I know quantum leaps are going to be rare, but like everyone's kind of training in similar ways for a similar competition, and I mean that makes a lot of sense. The question that comes to my mind, and maybe the sport or the art is just so focused that it's a little different from, like, let's just say me, who's an author, and I can, although writing a book is there's a way to do it. There's also a million ways to do it. There's a little maybe more leniency but when it comes to, like, let's just say like the highest form of performance in my realm, there are certain rules, but also there's less rules. And if you're heavily too much following the rules, at least in my art, then you're not going to be innovative. And I don't know if
Right.
there's any room for that in jiu-jitsu, where you can just totally throw someone off.
There's actually a lot of
Or
room.
or is everything just overly expected in that
No,
realm?
no, there's a lot of room for innovation, and essentially it is still developing a lot. So, in other words, there may be a current optimal strategy where people, the community has agreed, oh, this is the way you win. This is the optimal way to win. But there's so many people with such passion for the sport that it invariably changes. So a year from now, some three guys in New Zealand in their garage are going to figure out a different way to attack the problem. So when they get into competition, they're presenting new problems that people haven't experienced before, and they get a lot of success. And then the optimal strategy tweaks itself and changes a little bit. So it is exciting that way, and that's inspiring to me that a few people with passion and deliberate practice can change the game, and that's what we're trying to do for sure.
That's good. That's good.
Now, can you talk a little bit more why goals and and identity? Should I lump those together, or do you think those are two separate things?
We could talk about either one or both. They're very similar, by the way. Your goals
Yeah,
actually are the things that do shape your identity. I mean, that's kind of how it works. Is that your goal is the thing shaping your identity.
it, yeah. I noticed that when I had that, when I can, you know, dial into the identity, it also helps me. It helps support the behaviors that I want to do. When I had this idea of being a world champ, then I only ate whole natural food. I didn't eat processed food. And I try to reinforce that identity in my mind where if I was getting a coffee at Starbucks and I saw some of the food that they sell that I used to eat and I wanted to eat, I would say to myself, no, that's not food to me. I'm the person that I am doesn't eat that. A shark eats fish. I eat whole natural food. That's not food to me. So that sort of lessened the temptation for me. It was easier to resist when I looked at things in that way.
Yeah. I mean, a really simple breakdown of this is that your goal shapes your identity shapes your behavior.
Mm.
Your behavior reinforces your identity, and over time your behavior becomes your personality. So that's the simplest way to put it, and so it's, whatever goal you choose, that's the goal. And if it's a real goal where you start to think about it, visualize it, and really work towards it, that goal is literally the thing driving your identity. For a long time, your identity was be the champ because of your goal. If your goal was to be a coach, and obviously that is a part of your identity. But if you changed your goal to something else, it could be anything. It could be a millionaire, or it could be just be a great dad, or it could be something totally different. Whatever your goal is, that's the thing driving your identity right now. And your identity dictates your behavior. Obviously, to the extent you're committed to the goal, the more your behavior reflects the goal in that new identity, the more that identity will be, reinforced. And over time, that becomes your personality.
Very cool. Yeah, I think I've sort of ham-handedly did that for those 18 months that I was pursuing that goal. Can you talk about the subconscious and any sort of practices or methods that I could use to enhance what I'm doing?
Absolutely. Subconscious there's totally different ways of looking at the subconscious. Obviously, from a performance standpoint, in a lot of ways, you want to get out of your head, so that you're just operating in flow. I mean, that's one way of looking at subconscious. But how I look at subconscious, kind of on a more practical level, is your subconscious reflects who you are today. Your subconscious is not your future self. Your subconscious is you on autopilot. And so, your subconscious has a lot to do with what's preferable to the current version of you, not the future version of you. Your subconscious wants the Starbucks candy, right? The future version of you doesn't. And so in order to break subconscious patterns, you've got to be conscious and deliberate. And in order to do that, you've got to know where you want to go. So your subconscious is highly impressionable, though. I mean, it's very flexible. It is addictive, a subconscious, and your subconscious is driven by emotion. So for example, when you pick up your cell phone without thinking about it and start jumping into Facebook, the reason you did that subconsciously is because you've gotten addicted to the emotional chemicals, whether that's dopamine. If your body is addicted to stress, then you're gonna do things to create those emotions, and so your subconscious is driving you. But how you update or change your subconscious is, first off, you've got in old school self-improvement circles, they called it auto-suggestion, where you're basically telling yourself about who you want to be, in a definitive sense, like I am the world champ, just as an example. First off, clarifying your future self, and then telling people about who you want to be, telling people about your goals, telling everyone about your goals is very impressionable to who you are. When you start telling people about who you want to be, I love the quote that all progress starts by telling the truth. But also, the number one deathbed regret, and there's a lot of research behind this, that the number one regret of people on their deathbeds is that they didn't have the courage to be who they wanted to be. Instead, they lived up to the expectations that they thought other people had of them. And so I think when you start to be really honest about who your future self is and about the goals that you aspire towards, without the ego of feeling stupid that you're not there yet, and without needing to be that person yet. I mean, one of the reasons we don't tell people our goals is because we like to be seen as consistent. And if we're pursuing these big goals and it's obvious that we're not there yet, we're putting ourselves up to scrutiny. And obviously, if you've got, the goal is actually to tell everyone about where you want to go. And what you'll find is that for the most part, people will be very encouraging, but also you can create an environment of accountability. But by just telling people about where you want to go, you start to believe it more and more. Then obviously I would say journaling on a morning basis about who you want to be and about what you need to do today. When you actually start showing up in small and in often courageous ways, all those actions signal back to your subconscious who you are. And so by moving deliberately towards goals, your subconscious starts to update so that eventually your future self becomes the new norm. There are ways, journaling's big, telling people, making big courageous actions towards the goal, are big, but also I think financial investment in your future identity is really, really big. So, for example, if you want to be a better coach, you know, like the extent to which you're financially invested in that goal would reflect where you're at on a subconscious level towards that goal. You know, like if you get, you know, when you invest in an identity, when you invest money into a goal, you start to become incredibly committed to that. And your confidence in that realm increases as well, because then you can start to develop more competency. And so financial investment is a big one as far as upgrading your subconscious. I've seen this a lot even with money. A lot of people obviously have subconsciously limiting beliefs when it comes to money. And when you start investing money into your goals, into mentorships, even when you start giving money away, like to charities, you're sending crazy signals to your subconscious that not only can you have more money, but you can make more money. And so, you know, financial investment towards goals is a big one.
Can I tell you, I defined my goal about world championship. You know, I said, I want to be a masters. I'm in my late 50s, so I said I want to be a masters world champion. So I'm competing with guys basically my age, but they're very good. They've been competing for, you know, decades. And so I told my son and other people, I want to become a masters world champion, black belt. And if it takes me to be 100 and I show up when I'm 100 years old and there's no other competitors and they go, here, you win by default, I'll take it. But I'm working toward that. And I'm also competing. So, and if I win it sooner, terrific. So that seemed to work for me. But what was interesting...
Sounds like you were telling people about it.
I was. And here's an interesting thing that came from that is, so what I did to protect my ego a little bit is I was competing in the largest, the most prestigious tournaments available to me, because then, you know, if I didn't win, it was a softer, it was less painful to my ego. But there was a local tournament, and my son turned to me and he goes, oh, you should do that local tournament. If you're on the path to become a world champion, doing that tournament will move you further along the path. And it was so much more stressful and intimidating to compete in this local tournament, because I'd be competing against a local guy who also had an academy a few towns over. So there was, you know what I mean? You can understand how that would be a little bit.
There's more scrutiny, potentially more fear of looking stupid, right?
Exactly. But because I had put it out there, and then it came back from my social group, in this case my son, he said, yeah, you should do that. If this is, you're saying you want to be a world champion, this is going to get you closer to that. You should do it. And it sort of forced me in a way, or not forced me, but, you know, it encouraged me to face that discomfort.
They do call that a forcing function, actually. It's called a forcing function in psychology. It did force you.
It did. So I actually prepared for that tournament, and I actually came across some strategies to help me deal with the nerves, of the anxiety, the psychological stress, and I performed well, and it set me up to perform better later in the year. So it actually did contribute to me ultimately winning. Maybe I think it was 6 or 7 months later. So yeah, that worked.
That's awesome, dude. Yeah, I mean that's one of the benefits of telling people your goals is you can get alternative perspectives or solutions, and people want to encourage you. I mean,
you know what it did? Now that you mentioned it, it forced me to find a solution, because I said, wow, this is nerve-wracking. So I went out and
you would have not found that solution.
I would not have found it.
You wouldn't have had to.
Exactly. Yes.
That's one of the big reasons, honestly, why you want to tell people your goals, is because then it forces you to start showing up how you need to show up if you're serious about the goal. And when you start telling everyone about it, they're expecting you to be as serious as you're saying you're serious. You know, if you keep it secret, then no one's expecting anything of you.
And it forced me to sort of fix a problem I had. You know, I went out and I found this book by this author, Tom Bunn, and I think it's called Panic Free. Actually, it's a book written for people who have a fear of flying, and it's a really great book. And he has a couple methods in there, and I use them instead of flying, competing at this local tournament. And I wouldn't have found the book, I wouldn't have learned the techniques and the methods, and I wouldn't have had such a great performance if I didn't put myself out there, like you're saying, and get feedback and force function myself into it.
One of the easiest ways to describe the personality is as your comfort zone. To me, that's they're synonyms of each other, personality and comfort zone. And so your ego, to stay who you've been is to protect your ego. And if you become committed to growth, then you're willing to put yourself up to scrutiny. First off, because your future self isn't who you are yet. You're owning that. You're not overly confident in your current. I mean, you're fine with who you are right now, but you don't need to defend who you are today because you're actually seeking clearly something more. And so then who you are today doesn't need to be defended. You know what I mean? Because you're not as worried about who you are today. You're actually openly acknowledging that you're seeking to be someone else, and so it's okay to be back in the student seat. And that's one of the problems I think that a lot of people have with ego, is because they feel like they need to defend themselves and where they're currently at, so that they seem,
what I found,
whether it be smart or whatnot.
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
found my ego was related to the process. I said, I'm on the path to becoming this world champion. I'm in the process of it. So I'm only going to feel badly if I get knocked off the process. So when my son says, hey, you're not on the path if you don't do this tournament, I felt really bad. So it forced me to get back on the path. So I don't need the results immediately, but I need to be on the path to feel good about myself.
It's awesome, dude. It's a great story. I love it.
So I'm going to get back. I do a little bit of writing, but I don't do it in the morning. So maybe I'm going to start doing that and more deliberate writing. I've been basically just writing on a daily basis, but sort of just whatever ideas come to my head. And usually good stuff about being a better coach and stuff that will help my students become better students. But I think maybe I'll start journaling in the morning more intentionally.
Sounds awesome, man. What's your goal as a writer?
I think I want to find a way, as you said, to become the best coach I can be, but also to tell my students how they can become the best students they can be. Jiu-jitsu is a challenging sport. A lot of people drop out because of the frustration they face. Typically, a new student, the first 6 months to 12 months, they're the nail, not the hammer. And most people find dealing with that much frustration very difficult. But if I can give them sort of the right identity or this sort of concept that you're laying out, this program where, worry about your future self, don't worry about your current self so much here while you're developing, then I think it can help a lot of people, help a lot of my students.
So you want to write to help your students, essentially?
Yeah, I want to find the way to become the best jiu-jitsu student. You know what I mean? And become that myself, and then be able to communicate that to my students.
That's cool. Yeah, I would clarify the goal behind the writing, so that the writing then, I think you have it, but
yeah,
the process is shaped by the goal. And so, we know whatever the goal and the purpose is for the writing, that's going to determine what deliberate practice actually looks like when it comes to you writing. Because you want to be a master communicator, it sounds like it, helping provide, not only insights and perspectives to yourself and to your students, but to other people. Maybe it's not to other people, maybe it's just for yourself and your students. But, how is writing going to help you do that? I think defining the why behind it, and so that and the goal behind it, so that then when you're actually writing, it's targeted towards that goal, whatever that goal may be.
It's back to this idea of deliberate practice.
Yeah, what's interesting on the research of deliberate practice is that it's impossible to actually engage in it without a clear future self in mind. You can't engage in deliberate practice at a real level, because the word deliberate really matters. It's not about doing something for 10,000 hours.
Right.
It's about doing something from a deliberate practice standpoint. Deliberate practice, actually, from my perspective, means you're working towards a future self. It's very intentional, very directed. And if it's not towards, if the actions aren't towards where you're ultimately trying to go, then they're wasteful actions. Yeah.
That's fascinating, because there's a trap that many jiu-jitsu students fall into, is they come to practice, they come to training, and they come to either test themselves, like, where am I? How good am I right now? or to feel good about themselves. Oh, I got over on that guy. I beat that guy that round. And then, ultimately they lose a round, and then they feel bad about themselves, and they leave practice and training feeling bad about themselves, and they haven't developed themselves. They haven't captured all the learning opportunities that were presented to them because they weren't thinking about the future self. They were thinking about today's self, and they were trying to find some way to sort of bolster how they felt about today's self.
Yeah, we call that a fragile identity in psychology. It's based on a fixed mindset. When you have a fixed mindset, you have a fragile identity, and your ego is so high that when you fail, it shatters you, and then it can be trauma. I mean, trauma, failure becomes trauma, which shatters your hope and belief in yourself and your flexibility if you don't have that future self in mind that you're working towards. Because if you're working towards the future self, often the failures are just as instructive. And you're not measuring yourself on today, you're measuring yourself on where you're going. And if you failed, that's a lot of good information. Everything becomes informational. Yeah, it can still hurt. Yeah, it can be embarrassing and whatnot. And sometimes it takes a minute to pick yourself back up. In psychology, we actually call it a refractory period. A refractory period is the amount of time it takes to emotionally recover from an event. So like if someone cuts you off on the road, you might have an emotional reaction, but hopefully you can recover in 30 to 60 or maybe a couple minutes, 30, 60 seconds or a couple minutes. But, some events are so traumatic, right, that you never actually recover from the emotional experience. You're still defined by the past. You're still defined by whatever happened. And so when you have a clear future self and when you've let go of your current identity so much and you're willing to deal with the ups and downs, then you can have shorter refractory periods. So like what they talk about with high performance sports, let's just say basketball as an example. Kobe Bryant, he often would talk about how he had a very short memory. He'd shoot a shot and miss, and the next time around he'd shoot again. Whereas other people, they'd shoot and miss, and they'd hold on to that. So the next time around when they got past the ball, they wouldn't shoot because they were thinking about the last miss. And so you want to have a short memory. That's about shortening the refractory period, shortening your emotional attachment to whatever just occurred. Because Kobe wanted to be the best in the world. So like he was going to keep shooting. One of the things that he said that allowed him that level of flexibility, or that courage, and that willingness to fail was because he had stability in his own identity, right? He had stability in where he was going, and he also had stability, like let's just say with love and support from his family and things like that. Like, I mean, he had enough stability that he could then go out and keep failing and trying. Because when you're shooting for a future self, you're going to miss. You're going to fail a lot if you're actually genuinely working towards a goal. If you're just trying to confirm your current identity, then you'll just keep putting yourself in matches. For example, as a jiu-jitsu guy, like you'll keep putting yourself in matches that you could probably win, right? But if you're actually working towards a future self, you're probably going to be putting yourself in matches that you're more than likely to lose, because that's how you get better, right?
Exactly. And it's so funny you should talk about this refractory period, because essentially that's the exact thing that I'm personally trying to work on right now. Because I had a moment with my son a couple of weeks ago. We were training, and I was trying to, in jiu-jitsu we call it passing their guard. So it's an important point scoring situation in the sport. And my son is so good now that I just was putting in a lot of effort, a lot of attempts and counters and so forth, and I wasn't getting the goal accomplished. And I suddenly felt very frustrated. And I realized I don't want to feel that frustrated anymore. I want to shrink that refractory period, as you call it, down to nothing if I can. And because I realized when I got emotionally frustrated, I wasn't thinking about the technical aspects of the sport anymore. I wasn't learning anymore. I had to process that emotion. And I think frustration is telling us either, from a really basic point of view, it's putting the question to us, do you want to still do this? Maybe you should be doing something else. Or if you're going to do this, maybe you're going to try a lot harder. And just that deliberation is a giant distraction from learning and the art itself. So that's one of the things I'm trying to do, is just send that refractory period to zero if I can.
If you could, you would be incredibly flexible and immensely developed emotionally. And if that was the case, your learning would skyrocket because, from a trauma perspective, the reason people get stuck as human beings. This is not necessarily in jiu-jitsu, but this is just as a person. When a trauma happens and it hasn't been resolved, right, and the refractory period is still extending, could be years. It's the equivalent of you getting caught up, where you're no longer learning, and you've turned your brain off essentially, and so that's why it's so interesting, because when you go through a traumatic experience, this is why people's personality stops developing, is because they've had some event that they're still defined by, and they haven't just resolved the emotion and moved on. Instead, it's still there, and they're caught up in it.
You had mentioned Josh Waitzkin earlier, who I love his books too. The Art of Learning, I think, is his book, and his instructor is a very famous world champion, Marcelo Garcia, just an amazing jiu-jitsu martial artist. And when I watch him train, he seems to be able to completely leave his ego, and he gets immersed in the jiu-jitsu. So the only thing that seems to matter to him is the jiu-jitsu itself. So whether he's affecting a technique or somebody's doing something to him, it's almost like he doesn't feel any emotional upset of losing. He's almost just appreciating the art itself. Of course, I'm just imagining what he's thinking and feeling, but, he is truly a master and one of the greatest of all time at the art and sport of jiu-jitsu. But, I see that as the ultimate, that idea of appreciating the jiu-jitsu. Even if you're getting strangled or tossed in your head, it seems like he's thinking, wow, that's pretty cool, the way that guy just threw me on my head.
I think it was brilliant learning, and I think because he wants to keep expanding and extending and innovating, and he wants to keep growing, that's incredible information. He just learned something he didn't know before. He got thrown on his head, and it's like, because he wants to keep getting better and keep learning, rather than being caught up in what just happened, he just learned something incredible. And so, for him, that's exciting, because now he's got new possibility and new options to get better and better, right? And I think if that's the goal, is to keep getting better and keep learning, then failure becomes a really great, teacher. And you're not so ego about your own self, because you just got this deep lesson. Wow, what else? What does that open up for you?
Exactly. That's awesome. So, Dr. Hardy, I think we're up against our time here. This is an amazing conversation for me. Thank you so much. I felt a little bit selfish talking about my experience, but I think it put your book and your ideas into a practical framework for my listeners to understand how great your book is, and the value there, and the value in your ideas.
Thank you. I loved talking about it in this context. I think it was a fun conversation with me, a different version of the conversation for me, so I loved it. So Thank you.
So the book is Personality Isn't Permanent, and I want all my listeners and students to go out and get this book. I'm sure it's going to be available Amazon and all the bookstores. Is that right, Dr. Hardy?
Yep, anywhere. Anywhere and everywhere.
And what about you? How do they find more about you and your ideas?
BenjaminHardy.com. BenjaminHardy.com is where my blogs are. Also, for anyone who buys the book, there's free additional resources, online courses about journaling, personality, stuff like that. I even have writing courses that I give away for free. So, but for the most part, the book, I think, is really good for helping people understand why they're in their own routines and ruts, and helping you clarify that future self. There's about 150 journal prompts through that book, just to help you reframe traumas, and also to clarify your future self, and to reshape your story and your narrative and stuff like that. There's about 150 journal prompts through the book.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much, Dr. Hardy.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. It was so fun, man. Thanks for letting me be on your show and just to spend time with you.
And I've been reading your writing on Medium, and I've been on your email list for a long time, so I really appreciate you coming on.
It was a huge pleasure. Where do you live again?
We live in the Boston area. Yeah. Boston.
Boston?
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool, man. Well, I'll let you go, but it was really nice to meet you, and I loved this conversation. Good luck with all you're trying to accomplish.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
See you, man.
Take care.